All right, so before lunch we were talking about elemental anatomy, and one of the ways I tend to break down our understanding of a person is there's certain layers. Excuse me, we've got certain layers of our being, right? And we're just kind of looking at it on a physical level. You know, we've got kind of the whole constitution, right? So it's like the net totality of our body, its shape, its general tendencies, its characteristics and qualities. And again, we'll talk more about constitutional theory tomorrow. Then we've got, from there we've got like our organ systems, right? So organ systems being like, for example, like the urinary tract. Right, and the systems are comprised of individual organs. So like the urinary tract is composed of the kidneys and the bladder, and then all the tubules that connect it. You know, we talk of digestive system. You know, that's everything from the esophagus, the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, etc. So we've got kind of these systems that sometimes a whole system can go out of balance. But then the next level of detail would just be the organs that comprise those systems. So, you know, sometimes maybe someone just has an issue in the stomach, or maybe someone just has an issue in the gallbladder, but not necessarily the liver, or, you know, the lungs, but not necessarily the bronchial tract. So, so we can look at, and these are kind of the different levels of where things can go out of balance. So sometimes someone will have a constitutional imbalance. Some people will have a full systems imbalance. Sometimes people will just have an individual organ imbalance. And then the next level of that would be the tissues. So the tissues are the different types of, essentially different types of cells that comprise the different types of organs. So, you know, you've got different states that those tissues can exist in that lead to imbalances within that organ. And like, for example, earlier I was talking about the mucous membranes, right? That's a particular type of tissue. Or we have like smooth muscles. That's a particular type of tissue. Or the nerves, it's a very particular type of tissue. So when we're looking at tissues, we kind of are looking at what I see as being, at least from what we can assess with our senses and interview and things like that, that comprises kind of the like the core level that most holistic herbalists are working on. Of course, you know, when we get into the science and blood tests and all the fancy laboratory stuff, we can get down to like a cellular level, right, and start looking at cellular level kind of imbalances. But most herbalists really, you know, aren't necessarily doing blood work and kind of more complex testing like that. So we typically are working with what information we can extract from an interview or from our senses, right? So through just analyzing the patterns in their symptomatic picture, or looking at other holistic methods of evaluation like the tongue or the pulse or the medical astrology, etc. So there's different ways that we can kind of figure out what's going on with someone and then what level of imbalance is happening there. So, and they oftentimes influence one another, right? So sometimes the core imbalance is on a tissue level, and that's going to determine the state of the organ, which can determine the state of the organ system, which can determine the state of the constitution. So those are the different layers of the person that I like to look at. And sometimes, sometimes it'll be a little contradictory, right? Sometimes people might have a damp pattern in one part of the body and a dry pattern in a different part of the body. And that's why we have to know our herbs in accordance with that same pattern, which we'll talk about here. Probably tomorrow we'll go through our holistic blueprint of plants and people. So, so those are some of the main ways that we can look at, kind of assess the elements in a person. All right, is looking at those different layers of the body, from the constitution, the systems, the organs, and the tissues, through a good interview and intake process, looking at the tongue and the pulse, the astrology, simple symptomatic expression, right? So sometimes people, oh, I've got this pain in my stomach. It's like, oh, well, what's the nature of the pain? Like, what's the quality of the pain? Oh, it's all really sharp and burning, right? It's like, oh, okay, like that's pretty, usually pretty clear, right? What type of element is at play with that type of pain versus, oh, it just feels really heavy and kind of like sinking and kind of really dense, It's like, oh, that's a very different kind of pain, and a different element's going to be influencing that. Or, oh, I've got this cough. Okay, well, let me hear you cough, And if you get that really dry, wheezy cough versus a very damp cough, right, that helps you assess what's going on elementally in the tissue. And then so symptomatic expression is a good thing to look at. And then we can also look at just patterns of excess and deficiency. So we're looking at, oh, is this like a weakness or a deficiency in a particular tissue or element, or is there a particular excess of that element? So for example, if someone's really cold, we can look at that as a deficiency of fire. Sometimes that can also be seen as like an excess of earth. Or if someone is really dry, that can be a deficiency of water, or it can be an excess of air. Right, so there's different kind of ways that certain energetic imbalances can occur in the body, but one of the best ways to think it through is the relative state of excess and deficiency of that particular element. So that's just a little bit on kind of assessing the elements in a person and getting a sense for that. And I always say it's always important to kind of look for the pattern, like what's the pattern in the person, like if there was going to be like kind of one element at play here, what's that one element that's influencing them on multiple levels? And that's the ideal. Usually if there's overlap, usually there's a couple different elements at play, because as I said earlier, the elements rarely exist, well, I would say never exist in isolation, right? They always are working together to create a particular state. So I'd like to shift a little bit here into talking about plants and we'll come back to the elements in people a little bit later. We'll look at kind of how the elements interact and overlap with one another to create different patterns in the body, and it's kind of a fun exercise. We'll talk it through together, and you'll get the hang of it. It's like pretty straightforward typically. And tomorrow we'll discuss the elements again when we dig in a little bit more deeper into constitutional theory and tissue state energetics. And since we're a pretty small group, we might be able to do a little constitutional assessment if that's something you guys would be into. That can always be really empowering to learn that about yourself and to kind of see how it all kind of comes together. And we'll talk about the elements again too in the context of the 3 doshas of Ayurveda, which is a really great constitutional system. It's very simple, very straightforward, very easy to learn. But so I'd like to talk a little bit about how the elements reflect in plants. And one of the things when it comes to studying a plant, as I was saying earlier today, is that when we learn to observe the elemental influences within an herbal medicine, we start to kind of tap into this deeper essential level of the plant. We're starting to see into kind of the core underlying blueprint of that herb, like the primary energetic influence that determines literally everything about that plant. So when we're looking at trying to determine or understand or perceive which element might be dominant within a plant, we want to observe multiple layers of that plant and not just base it on one facet, right? So some people will say, oh, that plant has thorns, so it must be fire element, or oh, that plant works on, plant works on the lungs, so it must be an air element plant, and they'll just kind of tunnel vision in on one aspect of it. To me, when we're relating a plant to an archetype, right? Remember, we're talking about elements as kind of these archetypal influences or these angels, right? These big forces of creation. We want to really look at the wholeness of the plant, right? We want to look at the wholeness of the plant, everything about that plant, and ask ourselves, what's the essence of that plant, the essential nature of that plant, and which element reflects that essential nature best? So I want to first off here share with you my main framework for determining an energetic correspondence in a plant. And this framework applies to your work with the elements, it applies to your work with the doshas of Ayurveda, and it also applies to your work with the planets. So this is kind of like my universal how to determine an energetic correspondence to a plant. And these are just the different layers of a plant that are very important to assess in each herbal medicine as you do this. So the first is the habitat. Okay, so there's 7 of these. So the first is the habitat of the plant. So where does that plant like to grow in nature? Where does that plant prefer to, where does it thrive, right? And oftentimes here, just kind of paying attention to the elements of nature. So, notice like this plant likes to grow in the really moist, dark parts of the forest, or it's always growing along the river sides, or it's always on the south side of the mountain in the open field, full sun, or it grows in clusters only of its own species and nothing else, or it's just kind of scattered, one plant here, but it likes to be around these other herbs. So kind of really paying attention to the ecological dynamics. There's a lot of information we can glean from a plant based on its natural environment where it likes to grow in the wild. And that's why I'm a big fan of trying to be able to work with plants in their natural environment. Of course, you can obviously learn a lot about a plant just by studying it, and if you're just growing it at home, but there's a whole other layer of information by seeing where it really likes to be in nature. So habitat is one piece, and there I'm usually looking at kind of like sun and water. Those are kind of the 2 things, like what's that plant's relationship to light, and what's that plant's relationship like to water. And sometimes you can observe kind of the nature of the soil, like, some herbs really like to grow in really dry, hard, rocky environments. Some of them like a little bit more, a little bit more well built up soil and things like that. But for me, I'm usually looking at light and water. Next, we have the morphology of the plant. And morphology is a kind of a fancy term for basically the overall like physical qualities and characteristics of the herb. So what's its overall shape? What's does it tend to grow really tall and thin, or is there like kind of a lot of space in between it? What's the shape of the leaves? What's the edge of the leaves like? Is it smooth? Is it soft? Is it sharp and kind of serrated, or is it covered in hairs, or it's smooth? And does it have purple splotches all over it, or is it all green? All right, what's the color of the flower? So looking at all of those morphological dynamics, right? And to me, in order to really get a sense for that, we want to be able to observe that plant through the seasons, right? Because a plant looks really different now in spring that it's going to look like in October, right? So it's, and I've, there's been plants that I've sat with consistently, but I'd never sat with it during flowering time. And then all of a sudden I sit with it when it's flowering, and I'm like, whoa, there's like this whole other dimension to that plant that I wasn't aware of, because I'd never really seen it in its flowering state before. So I always encourage to be able to observe all the parts of the plant, through its life cycle, right? And then there's also kind of a layer of that with tuning into the cycle in the plant. So kind of like, when does it start to grow, and when does it leaf out, and when does it flower, when does it set fruit, when does it start to drop its leaves? And for me, tuning that into like the astrology can be very interesting to note when, especially like when a particular part of the plant is at its peak that you harvest as a medicine. Like, I noticed that, like one thing I noticed like around here, the yerba santa that grows up on the hillsides, the yerba santa, like clockwork, the last number of years, it always starts flowering like right when the sun moves into Gemini. right? And interestingly enough, yerba santa is this incredible respiratory tract remedy, and Gemini rules the lungs. So that's kind of like the timing of things, and you can start to tune into some of the energetics based on when things happen. Of course, might differ depending on, maybe the yerba santa in Northern California is at a different stage, but just for around here, that's what I've noticed. Okay, so habitat, and we're looking at morphology. Next we look at, so that's kind of like us with our senses observing the plant just as the plant is on its own. From there we want to go into how does that plant relate to the human organism. So the first point of contact that we have with it in terms of it influencing our body is through that taste. So the taste of the herb is a very important determining factor to consider for an elemental ruler. So tuning into, is the plant bitter? Is it sour? Is it pungent? Is it sweet? Is it salty? Is it astringent? Is it acrid? Right? These are all different kind of taste or flavor profiles that we can catch in a plant. So you can learn a lot about a plant from its taste, right? Everything from what types of medicinal properties it might have, what types of organs it might influence, what type of energetic pattern that plant has. You can determine a lot of that just by tasting it. So the taste is very, very important. Some herbal actions actually are completely dependent on you tasting that herb. Like the bitter flavor is a perfect example. The only way a bitter tonic herb can have its effect on digestion and stimulating gut secretions and all of that is if you actually, the bitter receptor on your tongue is triggered and sends that reflex through your nervous system to impact the gut. So that's why I'm personally not like a huge fan of herbs in capsules, because you don't taste it so much. That's just my personal opinion. I tend to prefer teas and tinctures and things like that, or powders. I really like, powdered herbs are really wonderful because you get the whole herb usually in a pretty decent sized dosage, and you taste it. Now that being said, sometimes certain things, let's face it, certain herbs taste like shit, and that can affect compliance with people, right? Like you were talking about, your wormwood and clove and Oregon grape and pau d'arco, nasty tasting herbs, right? I mean, it's like, it's a mistake that all beginning clinical practitioners make, where they're like, oh, I made you this great tea formula and it's going to calm your nervous system down. It's all these great nervous system herbs, and it's got motherwort, and it's got skullcap, and it's got valerian, and it's got hops. And it's like, man, those are all really bitter, kind of nasty tasting herbs. It's like I wouldn't even be able to drink that, and I'm an herbalist. So, you take a Joe Schmo or Jane Schmo off of the street and be like, here, drink this tea. It's going to be really good for you. They're just, they're not going to get it. They're not going to be able to take it because the taste is so difficult. So, that's why another reason why knowing your taste of herbs is really important from a formulation perspective, because you can have the most badass herbal formula in the world, but if the person can't get it in their body, it's not going to do them any good, right? So that's kind of an art with formulating and adding herbs together to slightly improve the flavor, but then also knowing what form to give it. So sometimes that's why a tincture can sometimes be a little bit easier for people to do, or sometimes capsules can be okay. I'm not a big fan of capsules, especially stuff bought in the store, because who knows how long that herb has been powdered, encapsulated. As soon as you powder something, it starts to oxidize and the quality just goes down. So anyway, taste, very, very important. So our next would be, what are the organ affinities of that plant? So where in the body does that plant influence, right? Does it go to the lungs, or does it go to the heart, or does it go to the liver, or does it go to the stomach, or where in the body does that plant influence? And Yeah, that one's pretty straightforward. And as we went through our elemental correspondences of the body, right, that can give you a lot of insight into an herb, right? It's like if a plant affects the heart and the small intestine, right, it's quite possible that that plant has a strong fire element, right? Like cayenne pepper, right, really warms up the small intestine, really warms up the heart and stimulates the blood and circulation. Obviously it's really hot too, tastes pungent, right? So we see how that you see how that works, like it grows in the hot dry desert, and the morphology is that bright red pepper, and the taste is it's really hot and spicy and pungent, and the affinity with the heart and with the small intestine, right, and the blood and circulation. So all those things match with the fire element, right? So we have affinities. Next we have the actions of the plant. So oftentimes we'll see actions kind of overlap with affinities. So sometimes and I think, in general, I'll do my little, this is my little herbal actions rant here. I think a lot of herbals these days, I feel like I've maybe gotten a little bit sloppy with herbal actions, in the sense that a lot of the listings under the action section in monographs actually don't have actions there. Sometimes there'll be affinities. So for example, under herbal action sections, you might see something say like hepatic. That's not really giving us an action, right? So an herbal action the definition of an herbal action is, an herbal action should give you a sense for how a plant will shift a physiological process in the body, right? So it's an action, right? It's dynamic, it's movement. It should show you how that herb is going to shift physiology, right? And I'll go in and define some kind of more traditional actions. What an action is not is like an organ affinity. So like hepatic, that doesn't really tell you anything other than that herb has an affinity for the liver, right? Or sometimes you'll see the term stomachic, right? That's just saying it has an affinity for the stomach. Or pectoral, right? It's having an affinity for the pectoral region. So so that's why I like to separate affinities and actions. And oftentimes, certain herbal actions have the affinity there. So for example, expectorant, right? And an expectorant action means it's going to facilitate the cough reflex and kind of cleansing and clearing the mucosal membrane in the lungs, right? So expectorant, anytime you see that, we know that plant is going to have an affinity for the lungs, right? But I like to have it listed out anyways. I like to see, okay, heart, lungs, liver, small intestine, okay, expectorant, cardiotonic, etc., in the action section. So the other thing that an herbal action is not is what it's good for, what it's used for, right? So sometimes you'll see and these are a lot of the ones that say like anti, so you'll see like anti-migraine, or anti-anxiolytic. Those aren't actions per se, it's how that herb is used. You see the difference there? Yeah, that's why I really love herbal actions, because it really paints the picture for you of how that herb is working inside the body. And it's how the herb is working inside the body that determines how it's used, like what kind of conditions and things like that it's used for. But I would much rather know that an herb is a stimulant expectorant rather than that it's good for bronchitis. Because stimulant expectorant tells me a lot more about what that herb does to the human body than it's good for bronchitis. Y'all catch the distinction there? Yeah, so actions really give you a good sense for specifically what that herb is doing to our physiology. The last thing that an herbal action is not would be kind of like a pharmacological mechanism of action. So sometimes you'll see like, under herbal action section, like, this herb is COX-2 inhibiting, right? Meaning that it inhibits biochemical marker cyclooxygenase and therefore is inflammation modulating plant. But that's not really an action. It's more of like a pharmacological mechanism that might result in a certain action. So I usually like to have that be its own separate section too, because it's not pragmatic. Like, no one's going to come to you and be like, I went to the herbalist because I need someone to inhibit my cyclooxygenase levels, right? Like no one's going to say that, right? They're going to say like, yeah, I'm inflamed, or I got joint pain, or I got headaches, So the biochemistry of herbal medicine is fascinating. I think it's super interesting. I think it can be, for people that have that kind of mind, that really like to understand the molecular aspects of plants. I think it's really good to know those things, but it's not always totally necessary. You don't have to know plant chemistry to be a great clinician, right? I remember Paul Bergner said one time that actually to try to practice clinical herbalism with only a pharmacological model actually doesn't really work. He said it can actually kind of cripple you as a clinician, because you're too busy thinking in terms of molecules and not looking at the whole person, right? That molecules, you're kind of reducing your perspective to this tiny little thing, and all of a sudden you lose sight of the whole person there, you lose sight of the whole plant, and the moment you lose sight of the whole person and the whole plant, you lost your holistic understanding, right? So our goal is to be able to have that wholeness of people, wholeness of plants, to go into that level of detail, but to always put it back into the context. So we want to know the actions of the plant. And I mentioned those things about what an action is and is not, because it can help you kind of trim down some of the big laundry lists that you'll see in herb books around what their actions are. So some classic herbal actions is like alterative, or carminative, demulcent, diaphoretic, diuretic, expectorant, bitter tonic, right? These are all classic, more we might refer to as a vitalist herbal action. Anytime you see huge lists of antis, you can usually scritch most of those out and move them into their own section of this is what it's used for. Used for migraines, anxiety, inflammation, tumors, etc. Does that make sense? Y'all see the importance of that? The actions, right? I'm a big fan of herbal actions. But a lot of folks tend to stop at those two. They'll stop at the affinity or the actions. And the next piece of the puzzle that's really, really important is the energetics. And this is where we really see the elemental model having a very strong influence in our understanding of herbal medicine. So we're talking about energetics. And within the context of herbal energetics, what we're looking at is 3 primary qualities. Well, for now, we'll talk about 2 primary qualities. I'll bring the third one in tomorrow when we talk about tissue states. But classic herbal energetics, oh, that pen's not very good. Look at 2 primary qualities. Got your temperature, and you've got your moisture. So under temperature, you got hot and cold, and under moisture, you've got wet and dry. So these are very, 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 very important. Very important to look at in all of your herbs. You have to know this about your plants. To overlook the energetics of an herb is to overlook really the root of how herbal medicine was practiced for a very long time. Because why this is important is that you can have, a couple people that have the same symptom, but with a different underlying cause, right? Maybe from a Western medical perspective, say, oh, we, swab the back of your throat or check the mucus out from your cough, and sure enough, you've got bronchitis or some sort of respiratory infection, some sort of viral respiratory infection, right? But maybe person A has a really wet cough and person B has a really dry cough, right? Same symptom, they got a cough, right? They've got an infection in their lungs, but the underlying state of the tissue, the energetics of the tissue is different, right? So we want to treat those people very differently, right? So we want to look at, in that situation, right? It's like, okay, what kind of an affinity do we want for that person, right? We want some lung remedies, right? Some herbs that influence the respiratory system. The actions we'd probably want would be some sort of an expectorant, right? But with the dry lung condition, you want to have like a demulcent expectorant, right? Something that's moistening, something that's going to help to strengthen the mucosal membrane to generate more fluids, right? And to balance that dryness in the tissue. The person with the really wet cough, you don't want to give them a demulcent expectorant. That's going to aggravate that problem, right? Because they already have too much moisture in there. So there you want to give more of like a stimulant expectorant, more of a hot, dry quality expectorant as compared to a cooling and moistening expectorant. You all see the difference there? The energetics, that's where you get really specific in your herbal medicine, and that's where a lot of herbalists tend to overlook that. They overlook looking at the tissue state, which we'll talk about tissue states a lot more tomorrow, and then they also overlook the energetics of the herb. So, and that's, where it can be really easy to get kind of lost and confused with our herbs, right? It's like, okay, this person has a cough. Okay, we want to give them an expectorant. So you go to your expectorant book, chapter in your herb book, and look up expectorants, and you get this big list, right, of all these herbs that are expectorant, right? And in that list, you'll see things like, well, what do y'all know? What do y'all know about expectorants? And just start shouting them out. Expectorant herbs. Any of them? Got things like, ginger. Say again? Ginger, a little bit expectorant, not super strong.
Combining with some things, right? Like
yeah, totally.
Black pepper.
Yeah, all those pungent oils. Honey is an expectorant. Yeah, has some demulcent properties. We got things like osha, things like licorice root, lomatium, wild cherry bark. That's a pretty classic. You see the wild cherry cough syrups, mullein. Yerba Santa that I was mentioning earlier, good expectorant. Colt's foot. What other expectorants? Yeah, there's so many. Elecampane roots, really great expectorant. Elder. So why'd you point like that?
Someone on the live comments.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, great. Yeah, elder, great expectorant. Right, so all these great expectorants. But notice in that list, I said osha and lomatium and licorice and marshmallow and colt's foot, right, and elecampane. Those are all very different expectorants, right? So if someone's like, someone needs this expectorant, well, from like a lot of people's perspective, they're like, oh, cool, I'll just pick any old expectorant and it should help them out, right? But not always, right? And so that's why we want to have this further differentiation of our herbs that gets us specific. So we have different types of expectorants. We have moistening expectorants, we have drying expectorants, we have warming expectorants, we have cooling expectorants. And when you kind of separate those out, right? So when you combine your energetics and your actions, you're able to get a lot more specific in your remedy selection. And when you get more specific in your remedy selection, the chances of that person getting better are significantly greater. You give someone with a really wet, boggy cough a thick, congealed marshmallow gruel, and all of a sudden their mucous membrane starts secreting even more fluids. That's going to aggravate that cough, right? They're going to feel like crap, right? And sometimes they actually might vomit, right? Because if you give because that's kapha, an excess kapha, too much water element in the lungs, and oftentimes the stomach can get overly damp there too. So you take a bunch of demulcent marshmallow, and sometimes you can overwhelm that kapha dosha in the body, that water element of the body, and sometimes they can purge to cleanse all that phlegm, cleanse all that mucus out of their system. Does that make sense? Energetics. Have any of y'all heard of herbal energetics before? Or heard that differentiation before? Yeah. Do you have a question? Or?
Well, do you want to talk about how, like, licorice can be used, like, for instance, like clearing that kapha out of the lungs, and how taking licorice and, like, from an Ayurvedic treatment to clear that out. It's like a moistening kind of domestic, how that works.
Yeah, so if you think of like a cup, how full a cup is with water, and you think if someone's got like what Whitney is referring to is how licorice root in Ayurvedic medicine is commonly used as a purgative, right? If you drink a really strong licorice tea, it's so sweet and it's so moistening that can actually upset your stomach to the point where you purge, where you vomit, right? And in Ayurvedic medicine, vomiting has a therapeutic benefit, right? It's kind of like looked down upon in Western herbalism these days. Like most people are a little hesitant to make someone throw up, right? Because let's face it, throwing up is kind of an unpleasant experience most of the time. But in a lot of systems of medicine, a purge is very therapeutic, right? And so the way that would work is like if you have an excess of damp accumulation within, for example, the lungs or in the stomach. Sometimes if you kind of push that too far, right? It's kind of a like treats like thing in a way. So if you kind of drink that really strong licorice powder and it's going to like overfill that cup to where it's like, oh my God, there's like so much dampness here, we have to get it out, and then you can purge that out. And in Ayurveda, when you throw up like that, it actually cleanses the lungs, cleanses the respiratory tissue out, because it's all that upward movement, right? That upward movement is what we're going for there. So yeah, that's just a little bit on the importance of energetics, right? So, and of course our 4 elements of water, earth, air, and fire directly correlate to those 4 qualities: hot and cold and wet and dry. And so this is the foundation of how Western medicine was practiced for like thousands of years, right? This was how what they call Galenic medicine, or the Greeks practiced medicine. Galen was the founder of Western medicine from the Greek tradition, and it was all based on hot, cold, wet, and dry. And each remedy was hot, cold, wet, or dry in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th degree. So 1st degree would be like very mild, like let's see, say something like maybe like fennel seeds, right, would maybe be seen as like a 1st degree warming herb, like pretty gently warming. Whereas something like cayenne, right, would be like 4th degree warming herb, to the point where it can like burn your skin, right? And so they had these kind of degrees of intensity of the energetics of those plants and different medicines that they used. And so then a person was classified that way too. Oh, they're cold in the 1st or cold in the 3rd. So then we want to give them a warming herb to the 1st or to the 3rd to balance that. But over time, it became kind of like very reductionistic. It kind of became a square, right? And I think because they were lacking that 5th element, that ether element is like that spiritual connection, and I think the Western medicine, because it just had those 4 elements and they kind of lost touch with that spirit, the spirit of the medicine kind of went away, and so it became very analytical, very reductionistic, and ultimately was overthrown by Paracelsus in the early 1500s, who we'll talk about Paracelsus in the alchemy and medical astrology day a little bit more. But he really wanted to bring back that spirit of the medicine into it, and that specificity, and kind of not getting too linear and reductionistic with the practice of medicine. So we're talking about corresponding an herb to an element, right? So we've got our habitat, where the plant grows, we've got its morphology, we've got its taste, where in the body it affects, the affinities, the actions of the plant, the energetics of the plant. And then lastly, we have what in Ayurveda they would refer to as the Prabhava. They call Prabhava, Prabhava, Prabhava. And Prabhava basically translates to special potency. And I really love this principle in Ayurvedic medicine. What's so cool about Ayurveda is they're like, boom, here's this super dialed in system of like all these dynamics and nuances you can know about a plant, kind of all these categories for how to understand a plant, how to understand the nature of a medicine. And they say, okay, here's the system of classification that encompasses everything about a plant. But then there's this principle of Prabhava, which is like the back door out of the system. So Prabhava is like, what's the thing about that plant that transcends its energetics, its actions, its affinities, its uses and properties, right? So what's the uniqueness about that herb? What's the special thing that herb does? What's its specialty? And under Prabhava would also be like our any kind of esoteric properties of the plant. So what might be maybe the psychological influences of that herb, any emotional dynamics that plant might work around. I also tend to think of what the eclectic tradition would refer to as specific indications. So that could be like any particular pulse or tongue diagnostic criteria that you want to look for, any psychological patterns that a person might exhibit that plant is particularly useful for. I also, because I'm so steeped in the alchemical tradition, I also tend to think of like the esoteric rulers. So I tend to think of like what type of planet that plant is connected to, or what type of element that plant is connected to, as another aspect of the Prabhava, the uniqueness of that herb. So like a good example of Prabhava would be like take the wild rose for example, right? That wild rose has this really beautiful affinity for the heart, right? The emotional heart, the spiritual heart, as well as the physical heart too. But we see that the rose kind of works around a lot of dynamics where the heart, people's hearts kind of feels really closed. Maybe they had past hurt from a previous relationship. Maybe there's some lessons that were being presented to them through that relationship that haven't exactly been integrated and embodied. So they tend to like repeat that same pattern in relationships over and over and over and over again, right? And so the wild rose has this ability to help our minds to understand our hearts more deeply and how we can retrain our habits and our patterns around relationships so that we don't have to repeat those patterns, and so that we can learn to open our heart again and not be closed down. Because right, it's like it happens to all of us. You know, we have a shitty relationship and our heart feels broken, even though technically it can't get broken, but it feels that way, and so we close down because it's like, that really hurt. I don't want to feel that again, so I'm not going to open up, right? And the rose is like, the teaching of it is like, just like a rose, just look at a rose. We can open up our heart just the way those flowers of a rose open and unfold that way. But we can also be protected too, right? That's why it's got those thorns on it, right? The rose has that protection. So how to have a strong but open heart. So that's all Prabhava, right? That's a unique thing. That's a very unique specialty that the rose does, that, you know, everything I just talked about with the rose doesn't fit under actions or energetics or affinities a little bit because it's around the heart, but it's a pretty particular kind of psycho-spiritual, emotional property of the herb. Does that make sense? You all understand the concept of Prabhava? So it kind of fills in the gaps a little bit. So you start to understand a little bit more about the uniqueness of that herb and kind of what that plant's specialty is, right? It's just like doctors, right? You got cardiologists, you got neurologists, you got gastroenterologists. That's their specialty. Plants are the same way. You know, to me, the plants are from an herbalist perspective, to me, it's like the plants are the healers, right? They're the real doctors here. I just kind of like do my best to facilitate them and give them to the right people. And so I think of plants as like specialists, right? Like the rose is a very specific kind of heart doctor, whereas hawthorn is a little bit of a different kind of heart doctor, right? Whereas each plant, you know, has its own unique thing that it does. And each plant is unique, each plant is special, that we can't box them in, right? That's why I always include this principle of Prabhava, because if we just try to understand a plant based on the little neat, tidy, square boxes and categories that help us to organize the information and help us to understand what they do, we'll miss something. We'll miss something that's very precious and very unique, and to me is like really the essential gift of that plant, right? And typically the Prabhava, the special potency of an herb, is usually kind of more of a subtle reflection of what it's doing on a physiological level. So what its actions and energetics and, and affinities and kind of how it heals the body on a physical level is going to be the more dense reflection of what that plant is doing on more of this psychological, emotional, and spiritual level too. Like I was saying yesterday, they're connected, right? The psychological property of a plant isn't separate from its physiological property, right? It's the same thing, just on a more subtle level. In the same way that our minds aren't separate from our bodies, right? And in the same way that our bodies aren't separate from our emotions, right? When you start to feel really angry, your body changes, right? You feel tangibly different in your physiology, right? That's why it's absurd to think of our minds and our emotions as being these completely separate, distinct things from our bodies. It's like, no, they're the same thing. It's not even that they're connected, it's just that they are the same thing, just a different level. Does all this make sense? Yeah. Okay. So these are the 7 things that we want to consider whenever we're wanting to look at this deeper level of a plant and that plant's association or correspondence to these patterns of energetic architecture that I talk a lot about in the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. So planets, elements, and doshas. This is kind of my universal framework. That framework that I just gave you really are like the critical, essential things that I think are essential for any time you're studying a plant. So anytime you're wanting to study a plant, I encourage you to look at all of these things, especially from a clinical perspective. You want to know how to use a plant as a medicine. Those last 5 are very, very important. Because those are the 5 keys for how to understand and use a plant holistically. So I was planning on teaching that framework tomorrow, but it came up now, so I'm giving it to you now. So those are the 5 really critical things that anytime you're learning an herb, keep those on your mental dashboard, right? You maybe start creating a notebook, like an herb notebook, or maybe you get all your books out and you're studying, cross-referencing things. That's what I'm looking for whenever I study an herb. And from there, with that foundation of those, taste, actions, energetics, affinities, energetics, and Prabhava, you get those things down, then you can take that and then understand what types of conditions or symptoms that herb is used for, but now it's in context, right? Now it's not just, oh, that's a good cough medicine. Well, why is it a good cough medicine? What kind of cough medicine is it? What specific kind of cough are you going to use it for? Does that make sense? So that's a really good solid foundation for really how to study a plant. That will definitely serve you very well, but that's also the main things that I'm looking at in a remedy in order to try to kind of feel out how it might relate to a planet or an element and things like that. So.